morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. I am your host. My name is Doug McKenty. This episode was recorded on October 20th, 2020. Today, I am joined once again by Canadian political activist George Roche of The Line Canada to discuss the current state of organized resistance against unconstitutional lockdowns imposed on many citizens in Canada and across the world. Though these measures are ostensibly to combat the spread of COVID-19, a disease which the CDC has determined has an infection fatality rate of just 0.14%, the rise of near-dictatorial powers imposing radical lifestyle changes detrimental to the natural functioning human economy has many worried about what this new normal will look like. George and his organization are literally drawing a line between the individual's right to choose and the state's seemingly endless quest for control. Find out more about The Line Canada and the weekly rallies held in Toronto in order to raise awareness at www.thelineinternational.com, on Twitter at The Line Media, and on Facebook at The Line Canada. Our conversation today also includes Dr. Joseph Hickey, a physicist, co-founder, and executive director of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, an organization of academics dedicated to combating the growing menace of a cancel culture threatening to severely limit the ability of many academics and others to feel free to express opinions outside the approved government corporate narrative. Many now live in fear of public humiliation or even job loss and blacklisting should they publicly advocate the benefits of living in a society based on the concepts of healthcare freedom, freedom of speech, and other tenets of a free society. Discover more about the OCLA at OnCivLib on Twitter, the Ontario Civil Liberties Association on Facebook, or at www.ocla.ca on the web. Stay tuned for this discussion, which not only includes a psychological analysis about how we got here, but dives deep into the challenges faced by those who attempt to speak out against it. We will cover the reasons why so many go along with the perceived threat and the draconian measures imposed, despite evidence showing the virus is not as dangerous as the economic impacts of lockdown. We'll also offer solutions to the current emotionally toxic environment that pervades political discourse today. Please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this podcast. In these days of independent media censorship, we rely on listeners like you to distribute this information. You can find out more about this program at The Shift with Doug McKenty on Facebook and YouTube, at DMcKenty on Twitter, or at www.theshiftnow.com on the web. I'd like to thank George and Joseph for agreeing to appear in this episode, and thank you for helping to make the shift. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for listening to this exclusive Shift episode. I've got George Roche from The Line Canada and Joseph Hickey from the Ontario Civil Liberties Association joining me today. They just had a great anti-lockdown rally up in Toronto, Canada this weekend. These guys are trying to organize as best that they can against the COVID lockdowns that we're dealing with all over the world actually right now. And so I just wanted to have them on to get an update as to how it's going organizationally, and then really have a conversation about a broader conversation about political strategies, how to educate the public about what's going on and how to get people involved in organizing against what we're having to deal with here in terms of these lockdowns. So thanks, gentlemen, for coming on. I really appreciate it. And why don't you tell us how the rally went and just give us a little bit of your background and tell us about your organization. George, do you want to go first?
Absolutely. I'm the executive director of The Line Canada and The Line International, and we've been very active in doing the demonstrations at Dundas Square now for the past 27 weeks, which has grown tremendously and has caused us to reach out to other like-minded groups such as OCLA, the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, with whom Joseph is the president of. And I did a lot of research on OCLA. Not that I had to, in previous times. No disrespect, Joseph. I think OCLA serves an amazingly important purpose. It's urgent. It's serious. It has absolutely everything to do with what's going on today, now more than ever, in my opinion. So part of the Line's mandate is to connect with these resources and, play the relay game, get that information out there, post the evidence of our claims. The credibility of many organizations right now who are supporting civil rights are being slammed mercilessly all over social media, all over mainstream media, we're being minimized in our efforts naturally because we're presenting a very strong argument against the tyranny and the oppression that we're experiencing from our local governments.
And then, Joseph, you want to talk about a little bit about what the Ontario Civil Liberties Association is doing?
Yeah, so I'm the executive director of the Ontario Civil Liberties Association. We're mostly based in Ottawa, Ontario, and we have been operating since January 2013, so for a few years now. And what was the impetus for our founding and starting our work was really noticing an erosion of freedom of speech and the other fundamental rights in Canada, and specifically seeing university professors fired for criticizing the administration of their institution, government employees fired for blowing the whistle on something of obvious public importance and interest, laws not being followed, and legislation not being constructed in the proper way, and so on, and many other cases of whistleblowers being repressed. And so we were disappointed to see that what you could call the establishment civil liberties associations that were formed in the 1960s in Canada, and that were very radical at the outset back in those days, had really become absorbed into the establishment. And so that, attorneys general in the government would be coming from the establishment civil liberties associations, and either going into these associations or coming from them. And so they're basically now integrated, woven into the mainstream establishment. And so we really felt that it was time for something new. There needed to be an organization that was going to be completely nonpartisan, was going to truly defend the principles of, in particular, freedom of speech and the other civil liberties, freedom of association, freedom of movement, and so on. And so we make it a point of policy to defend the individuals who are under attack for something that they've said, that where no one else will defend them. And so we say everybody has freedom of speech, even on the most controversial, the most taboo subjects. And we, unlike many other organizations, never take a position in favor of or against the content of the speech. We don't take any position. We just say, the person has freedom of speech, and that's that. And so you can't start persecuting people, punishing people in ways that go beyond reasonable sections of the criminal code. So things like so here's another aspect of our philosophy, is that a spoken act can have multiple components to it, and one of those components can be committing a crime, like uttering a death threat or inciting physical violence, and those things exist in the criminal code in Canada. But there are other laws that try to criminalize the thoughts, the expression, the emotions of people. And so we separate those two things, and we, in an absolute sense, we defend the expression side of people's interventions. And so that is like kind of our fundamental starting point, and that leads us to defend all civil liberties. We think that you need to authentically be able to express all viewpoints to have a democracy. And nowadays we're seeing that it's gone much, much further than just freedom of speech. I mean, in Canada, we had borders closed between provinces. We had people locked into their houses. Medical doctors who are under attack for having opposing views and having complaints brought to their professional colleges, and other doctors trying to get them decertified and or punished or disciplined. And the list goes on and on. And so we have in the COVID time of this year, we have taken more of an intellectual or academic approach to things, and we have a senior researcher, Dr. Rancourt, who has done a lot of work and has looked at really gone over and reviewed the science on face masks, for example. And that was the basis of our letter to the World Health Organization, where we reviewed how many randomized controlled trials have been done over many years on the question of whether there is a positive benefit of using a face mask in the case of a viral respiratory disease, and there is no reliable scientific basis for these policies. And so we used that analysis and that letter we went to the very top when the World Health Organization made its flip in June 2020. And then we used that as a basis to appeal to many municipalities in Ontario that then started imposing local bylaws forcing masks on people based on the World Health Organization's decision.
Mm-hmm.
And we also put out a statement where we recommended peaceful civil disobedience against these policies, and we provided some guidelines for how to go about doing that. So those are some examples of the kinds of things we do. We are a small group of volunteers, but we try to provide some analysis and guidance in a principled way that can help people in Ontario organize and push back against these incredible things that the government is doing.
Right. Are you mostly lawyers? Are you providing legal assistance?
No, we're mostly academics.
Okay.
So I myself am a physicist by training. And so in this case, we've been able to use our scientific expertise to do analysis of some of the scientific claims regarding COVID.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, we're generally more on the academic side. Lawyers typically don't like us because we defend cases that are very controversial, and generally they know that it's not going to be good for their careers to associate with us. So it would have to be a very principled and very radical lawyer to get involved in one of our cases.
Sure. It is amazing how much this, and now they're calling it the cancel culture, is affecting the world of academia, where so many people are afraid of being able to speak their mind in public about so many things because they're afraid of being publicly censored or even losing their jobs over what's going on. I did an interview with Mark Jeftovic, who wrote a book on cancel culture and just describing ways to try to get around it, and that more and more people are having conversations behind closed doors, private messaging, things that they may have in the past posted on Facebook or posted on Twitter, but knowing if their real political beliefs get out there, then their jobs are at stake and certainly their reputations. So, thank you for doing that work. And I hope that we can start to create more of an atmosphere, especially within the halls of academia, to be able to have the kinds of conversations that need to have in order for a democratic society to move forward. I mean, people need to be free to feel like they can express themselves, and we can talk about a variety of topics. It's a serious deal. So I want to get back into that, but first let's discuss the rally that you all put together. So the OCLA is endorsing now the Line Canada, and the two of you are working together, and you put this rally together in Toronto last weekend. George, do you want to speak to how that went, and maybe even some of the challenges and pitfalls to trying to organize something publicly like this in the current state of affairs?
I got to tell you, to the latter, it's getting easier.
Great.
Not more difficult.
Yeah.
Naturally, when you have the momentum and you have growing support, it's gotten easier. I don't really have anything controversial to report, except I do feel I will elaborate on what Joseph mentioned. And first of all, the OCLA have endorsed the line, which we are certainly happy about, because I know the work of the OCLA due again to my recent research, And it really is hand in glove. They're an academic arm in this area, and we've got boots on the ground to bring those messages forward. We're going to be tightening up our game board as time goes by, but with respects to the rally itself, it went tremendously well. When you talk peaceful rallies, I think so far what we've done is the epitome of that. Nobody can say anything regarding a violent approach or a disrespectful approach. We've acknowledged everybody as the rights acknowledge everybody, the human rights, that is. So I'm thrilled at the way it went. We had some excellent speakers, as you alluded to. We had some spontaneous people show up. The officer from Laval was nothing short of inspirational. He, I guess you could say, put all the police in the country on notice with his remarks regarding his reattachment of his own mind to freedom and free will, to set aside these absolutely unrealistic, abusive expectations. A mention that Joseph made too as well was the restriction on free speech. So the line is not adhering to any of those policies. In fact, when I read OCLA's civil disobedient list on the notice, I looked at it, and a check mark is beside every single one of those attributes. So we're on the right track. And that's why I reached out to Joseph, because, again, you look at the clout of academia that he's got over there, and when we start to take an umbilical cord and attach our mission to that, we have a plethora of information that the general public are certainly being more open to hearing about, in dire need of, and are now acting on. Where it's kind of like these phases took place where people kind of had to get it a little bit and then really focus on what the messages were and then begin to design a behavioral response to that. Well, so far what we've seen is growing crowds from 1,500 to 7,000.
Great.
And now we're collecting people off sidewalks. So, I mean, evidently people are starting to listen. That's the point.
And I want to say a huge congratulations and kudos to George and the line for organizing these events. It's really amazing. It's so exciting to see all these people coming out and obviously having a good time. Obviously feeling that it's an important participation, and very enthusiastic. And it's just such a thrilling thing to see. I mean, I wish that we were able to be even more involved, so at this point we're supporting and we're as much as we can. And, but it's really very exciting to see this happen.
Well, that's an interesting thing. The one thing that we've noticed is, and Joseph said it, people are having a good time. We don't have a bunch of anxiety-ridden egos running around the streets fearing what they're doing, fearing what they're believing or saying, as contrary in the groups of people who are attacking us, whether that's online or in the media or what have you. There seems to be this very narrow thinking of, if you are doing this work, you are selfish.
Right.
You're a jerk. It's just a mask, don't be a jerk. It's just a vaccine, don't be a jerk. It's just contract tracing, don't be a jerk. We start to adopt these beliefs and obey them, the smiles on the faces of our attendees are going to be evaporated. So the pushback is extremely important. Grassroots initiatives are vital to this kind of stuff. And we've been really concerned. We've had a lot of politicians trying to enter the stage. We're doing our best to keep away from tying ourselves to a party or to a political message. We want to remain relevant to the people because they are the ones who are being affected. Many of the politicians are still getting paychecks and they still have a job. And they're still spouting false data pervasively. Despite enormous amounts of evidence to the contrary, they are sticking to this agenda. So now we've got people who are unfolding through all of this. And I think this is, these messages start to get other links attached. One would be people are now trying to find out what the IMF gave to our MPs to lie to us. Where's the money? So people are wanting to follow the money. What was Gates doing here back in April, talking to 400 Ontario mayors? No media, no minutes, no follow-up. Why are we not seeing this information?
Sure.
Why does every Canadian taxpayer not see the reasons for Gates' intervention? Only Bonnie Crombie tweeted out from Mississauga, indicating, quote, that Bill Gates is here to see us through COVID. That's a very, very concerning statement to me.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And we're seeing organizations going straight to city governments here in the United States, too. These public-private partnerships that we're seeing often just target city governments and then circumvent any kind of national debate or even a debate on the state level. And then they're working with the city governments kind of behind closed doors. We don't really even know what's going on, and they're making these long-term plans. I think it's a tactic, frankly.
Especially if they're Democrat-run cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty amazing how easy it is for these organizations, these large organizations, Google, Facebook, Amazon, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a lot of these foundations working behind the scenes to go straight to city governments. And a lot of times the citizens of the city don't even have any idea what's going on until these plans have already been made and the money's already changed hands. Like you said, follow the money. I mean, there's so much money flying around right now, and we can see the agenda that it's promoting. And it's one of the things that makes it so challenging to organize against it, because we're up against really, really big money players. But let's
the oligarchs.
Sure, right.
The elites are out there in full swing with their cash. It's interesting to me. We're not seeing as much activity in this country from Antifa or Black Lives Matters because it doesn't seem that Soros is banking on a lot of people taking him up on the job. But what we are seeing is minor resistance groups showing up. We had two actually at Dundas Square the other day who were anti-protest groups. Didn't make any difference. Clearly, we're leading the way with the message that is largely revolving around the exposure of the government's misleading of its people in several ways. And I believe all of that is starting to crack.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to believe. I mean, with the amount of information that's out there right now, you've got to think more and more people are starting to question the official narrative because, the numbers just don't back, and they never have backed the initial fear-mongering that we got. But let's stick to the idea of human rights right now, because I think that this has gone. I mean, people just don't even understand what you're talking about anymore when you're talking about the importance of free speech. So, George, will you talk about the symbolism behind the line? You've got your logo with the circle and the line through it, just in terms of like letting the audience know how to make a boundary. I mean, it seems really important to me because so many people, in my mind, are allowing themselves to get pushed around right now. And, people need to kind of wake up to the fact that they need to be responsible for themselves and know how to make really solid boundaries against when people are doing this kind of behavior against them.
It's quite indignant when you have organizations who've been around for as long as Ontario Civil Liberties Association has, being ignored and diluted in the mix. Mm-hmm. So our logo directly confronts that sort of oppression with the O, and the red paint slash is the blood of the people who died to extricate us from such oppression. Hence the French Revolution. I mean, what was that about? Millions of people fought and died to make the world safe for democracy, and yet we have these power control freaks running around right now, partnering up with elitists who are buying their way into our governments, who are willing to obey their agendas, and the suffering is then downloaded onto the people, its taxpayers, its audiences, its children, its institutions and industries are all suffering at the same rate of speed, some more than others, depending on your income or economic levels. But the reality is everybody is experiencing some impact to a greater or lesser degree, which has arisen out of the relationships, obviously, that have been formulated to control our governments. not to allow them to lead, but to teach them to dictate. And that requires the squashing of liberties. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah. Just something that comes to mind as you're talking, and in the last segment as well. There, that I mean, the protests that George and the line are organizing are different from just any old protest, because nowadays it's actually an act of resistance or activism just to go to a protest, especially when it's against the laws that are trying to keep us all apart and isolated and locked at home, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very powerful to have that event that's happening, especially if it's regular, and people get to know that that it's happening, that it's growing, and that well, as an individual, I can think, well, maybe I'll try to get my courage up and go and join it next time, and that actually becomes the individual act of having dignity and making a decision for yourself about how society should be organized. And it gives an opportunity to participate in society in this, what they call the conversation, or basically the decision making process. If we're going to have a law that prevents people from organizing, gathering, then a protest becomes the point of contact between the individual and the state. It's
sure.
Well,
right.
That's a great point, because they can't censor you, they can't shadow ban you.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's public.
But I think what's essential is that individual action. And we talk about building community, we talk about organizing, but what really matters is that individuals are willing to take risk and stand up for themselves and have courage and confidence and dignity. And then when you decide to do that, then you reflect on it, you communicate it, you share it with your network, and that way you're informing one another and you're building an organization. But that is secondary to the individual's choice to take an action.
Right.
Very true.
Yeah.
One of the things that kind of, as I was preparing for this, I read the letter that you sent to the World Health Organization, and one of the things on the list, reasons why you should wear a mask, was actually, because of the social stigma against not wearing a mask. Like, you'll be fitting in, and that'll be good for you. And it just really, it like flew out on the page. Like, well, why? It's like they're imposing this one-sided view of how dangerous COVID is and how great the masks are. And then they're saying, well, since we've convinced most people of this, then it behooves you to wear a mask because then you'll fit in. I mean, this is actually, they're not saying to people, you should think for yourself and make your own decision. They're saying to people, gosh, you should succumb to the peer pressure here. Most people think like we do, so just do it and you'll feel better. I mean, it was just a wild thing to say, right? From a professional scientific organization, right?
It's incredible. We're offering you a way to conform.
Yeah.
Here's a symbol you can use to conform. And
right.
So this is the thing. We're offering it to you for free.
Yeah. And just do it. And if you conform, it'll make you feel better. I mean, I just thought, what a crazy argument. Like, even if I was trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, I wouldn't just say it like that. I'd come up with something better, Anyway, it was just one of the many mind-boggling aspects of what we're going through here. I mean, like you're talking about, Joseph, sometimes I sit around and I wonder how many people are actually thinking in the lines of how we're thinking here today and having this conversation, but they're not coming out because they're afraid to talk. I mean, there's literally an oppressive atmosphere where if you speak your mind and say, hey, what are we doing? Why these lockdowns? Then you're running a really big risk of getting publicly shamed. I mean, as you talk, I mean, it goes through the roof. It's I call it a sort of a passive aggressive form of censorship, right? They're not necessarily burning your books in the street or burning you at the stake, but if you have an idea that does not conform to the official narrative, you're definitely going to have to take a hit. and that's the environment that we live in. And so, like, what has happened socially that we've gone from a culture of believing in freedom of speech? And this is the other side that I wanted to talk about with you too, is that it's amazing to me how few people seem to even comprehend the importance of something like freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. And they're just willing to say, well, the government has told me this, so they must be right. And if you disagree, then you're wrong, and you should be censored. I mean, I've had friends. It seems like it's been growing for decades now, from the politically correct movement, to the hate speech idea, and now all the way to this place where basically, if you disagree with the authority, then you must be wrong. You must be hurting people. You must be a psychopath. Like you were talking.
Well, again, you're talking about, look at it as a family systems dynamic, where you have a whole bunch of people obeying the parents, but a sibling steps out of line. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, mommy told you and daddy told you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now they've elicited the aid of another family unit, which is the siblings. Some people call this sibling rivalry. I call it enmeshment. But the reality is we have a lot of blind obedience going on. And when the inversion, in my opinion, between how government should feel about its people and people toward its government, right now we have a backward scenario where people fear the government and not the other way around, as it should be. So that tells us that people don't have the insight or the knowledge, and that they feel by idealizing their government, they have done something virtuous. Their judgment is good. They are moral in doing so. And this is what propels the wherewithal to attack other people who don't want to buy into that narrative. It is under that basis that their virtue is wielded. And while it's disagreed with by many growing platforms, scientists, doctors alike, you look at our stage, it was there was a few people, a doctor who gave up her practice to join free speech and to speak truth, I believe she said. You have a police officer who's done the same. This is not usual courage when you have people on the other side of the continuum who simply don't know what they're talking about. They can't know what they're talking about. 7,000 people sitting in a square in Toronto protesting the lockdown measures and other oppressive ideologies, freedom of speech, section 2, 7, 8, 9, and 15 are getting tossed around like they never existed. You can't have 7,000 wrong people in one location. Actually, what you have is 7,000 people who have done their homework, have unfolded to what's really going on, and have joined the movement based on provable data that they've uncovered. It's not what we're saying. It's not what we're saying. It's what we're all believing. It's not like we sold them the idea. We did help to disseminate information. Ookla has pushed information out into the public for people to consume. They're tying excellent nouns to verbs, as many other groups are. So I think what we're seeing right now in this oppressive world is the government, while the people are dependent upon the government, the government is dependent reciprocally on the people, especially the mask wearers, to continue to march with its narrative. And so our mandate, as we see it, is to combat that through our protests, through a constant, relentless stream of information. We are in an information war, after all.
Yeah.
I mean, people got 20 scientists over here. We got 30,000. Their 20,000 are right, and ours are drop dead wrong. You see, it's all or nothing. Nobody's willing to consider, at least the people who are sleeping aren't willing to consider the new information available to them that would fundamentally help them to arrive at a better understanding. It's become competitive. It's not a mission, it's a competition. If the mission of the mask wearers and the people who believe in what the government's measures are doing for us, if they were willing to speak up, and I mean, come to our rallies. I've offered it many times. You've seen it on my Facebook, Doug, where I've said, come on out to our rallies. I'll happily give you the microphone. You can teach us everything you think we don't know.
How many rallies have you done so far, George? And how often are you doing? Are you doing them like once a month?
Once a week. Rallies?
Really, once a week, every Saturday?
Every Saturday.
In Toronto?
Yep.
God, that's great. God, I can't even believe, like, we're nowhere near that here in the United States. We've got so much to learn from you guys. So yeah, thanks for coming on.
Well, you guys got guns. Let's not forget about it. When people know that there's lead flying around, I mean, holy crap. I mean, they could get killed. I can understand their resistance to the resistance.
Yeah.
I don't, you know, we're a little less threatened by the bullet.
You know, what's funny, as you know, though, like even these militia movements and whatnot we have in the United States, like they end up, I mean, we all are ending up getting branded as these white supremacist Nazi gun-toting, you know, machine gun-toting crazies, which is not nearly the majority of us. You know, most of us, I'd love to see a peaceful protest where I'm just trying to get the information out. I'm fighting an information war here, you know? And so it's crazy and that's what I see here. You know, the mask wearers see a militia guy and they just, you know, they're never going to have their minds changed by that kind of dialogue, I guess. And, you know, and trying to get the information out to the average mask wearer in a way that they can hear it, it's just so challenging because their ears are closed to alternative perspectives. And I'm afraid that, you know, as I'm saying, like these gun-toting militia guys are really turning them off, and they're not going to hear any message that comes from that sector of the community. And I don't think it's even a majority of us.
If somebody's bringing guns to the fight, and you know, and you're being threatened, you're going to give up your rights pretty quick.
Yeah.
Doug, you asked the question, you know, how did we get here?
Right.
Freedom of speech. You know, and I wanted to just add the point that the topics or subjects of speech that are the most taboo are the ones that are the most geopolitically sensitive.
Sure.
So it really is operating at a very high level. These propaganda campaigns, these different legal campaigns and actions by the state to repress speech that have happened over, you know, decades. But you have things like criticism of the actions of the state of Israel, racism, environmentalism, including climate change, gender orientation, feminism. These are some of the topics that are among the most sensitive and taboo. And there's geopolitical reasons for this.
Mm-hmm.
And so what ends up happening is that as laws and policies are imposed and examples are made of controversial speakers that where they're successfully persecuted based on their speech, the society starts to move into a state where it becomes harder to oppose all laws and all changes. It becomes harder to, as an individual, contest a powerful organization or a powerful figure like a politician that wants to implement a new law. And this is actually the subject of my PhD research in physics, was a simple physics model of individuals interacting in a society and forming a social hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want to mention this because I think it gives some insight into how these things change over time, is that what I found is that a society has two fundamental features that control its structure. So in other words, how equal or unequal it is, its distribution of status of people in the society, and then also the stability of that structure over time. So whether it's going to retain its shape, its level of inequality for a long time, or if that's going to deteriorate and run away into something that degrades very rapidly and approaches a totalitarian state. And so what ends up happening is that the two features that control these things are the degree to which an individual can fight back and win sometimes
mm-hmm.
in the interactions where they try to oppose an imposition of power on their lives, and the degree to which you're punished if you lose. So what happens is that for small values of these two features, so your ability to fight back and win, and the degree to which you're punished, if for small values you end up having a stable society. It might be very unequal, but it maintains its shape for a long time. But if you increase the value of either of these parameters, in other words, you can interpret this as if you make it as a society harder to have freedom of speech, you eventually cross over into a region where the structure rapidly deteriorates and you start to slide away. And you move towards something that is a kind of totalitarianism where very few people in the society have massive status, and almost everyone else is down at the end of very low status. And so when you move into that runaway phase of the society, it becomes very hard to pull out of that, because what is required to revert that trend is for individuals to be able to defend themselves and win some interactions against the more powerful people that are making the rules. And so, but when you get into this runaway slide where the society is degrading, that happens very rarely. So the society is in a sense lost because it's hard for it to pull itself out of this. This There's a risk of crossing over into that where things can slide away from you.
Well, absolutely. And then what's fascinating to me right now is the number of people that are, the number of common people who are actually facilitating this drive into totalitarianism by applying this kind of social pressure that the World Health Organization's even mentioned, right? It's just so strange to me that people have lost, it's like they don't understand the importance of the freedoms that have been fought for in the past. And now they're sort of almost, George and I, in our last conversation and in the interview I did with him, would call it almost a Stockholm syndrome, where these people are being abused. They're not allowed to make choices for themselves. They're not being treated as adults. And yet they're perpetuating the cycle of violence by actually, and in a sense, I think mostly passive aggressively, imposing on their fellow citizens. If I was to walk, I can't go to a store in my neighborhood here without a mask on, or else people would be jumping all over me. It would take I'd have to be able to put forth a lot of effort to combat it here. I think for me personally, like going straight to the sheriff or going straight to the local government or trying to have more public conversations actually is more worth my time than just being a mask rebel, because there are just so many and the social pressure is so profound. And it's just fascinating to me that we've gotten to a place where, as we're clearly sliding towards this totalitarian model that you're discussing, it's the citizens themselves that are self-policing this. It's mind-boggling to me.
And the very same citizens are thanking their governments, for our government, for robbing them.
Right.
It's like they're hailing and idealizing the people, their captors, as if to say, we're okay with giving up a few of our rights to allow for your mandate to have this kind of room and occupy our lives the way that it is. And they're doing this without question.
Yeah.
This is blind obedience. And I think I mentioned this before, if you remember Adrian Iser, who referred to this as the dominator society, where a group of people have power over another group of people, usually a minority or people who are weaker, perceived to be weaker than them. And the weaker than them group is basically complementing the efforts of their captors, as if to suggest they are correct, that they are being treated properly, and the government sees things appropriately, and these people are oblivious to what's actually going on behind the scenes.
Right.
Conversations that are occurring with people who are impeding our sovereignty. Again, without question. So they're not doing the homework. They're attacking people who are knowledgeable. When asked to produce some kind of evidence to their claims, you don't get science, you get smeared. So obviously things are backwards.
Yeah, so you get punished if you oppose the state narrative, the state propaganda. You sense at least, you perceive that you're going to be punished.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you invest.
We got arrested. We got arrested on Friday.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
For that very reason.
I'm not saying that perception is wrong.
Right.
No, it's not. We knew we were right. We got arrested.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead,
Right.
Joseph.
Yeah. Well, but you invest in it, right? So you decide, well, I don't want to get punished, so I better go along with this. But then it's hard to go along with something that is gives you cognitive dissonance, right? That it doesn't make sense.
Right. It doesn't make sense.
We touched on that, haven't we?
Yeah. And that's where I have been going deeply into this idea lately, because when I try to explain to people in my community, I studied philosophy in school, so I thought reason was pretty important to people. And I've spent a lot of my life, trying to construct rational arguments, thinking if I can just use reason really well, then I can have there's social change is going to come of it. If I work on being a rational human being, I can go to my fellow man and I can say, hey, here's a really rational argument. Will you check this out? Oh my gosh, Doug, you've thought about this really well. I think you might be right. We'd have a conversation, and actually
that's a disorder today.
Right.
That's a disorder.
The older I get, the more I'm like, well, I keep coming to people with rational arguments and I just get like, shut up. Don't talk about that. You're just a crazy person. And it's like, what am I? So I got, I studied a little more psychology than philosophy. It was like, oh, this is called cognitive dissonance. I'm starting to understand what's happening.
Hang on. Yes,
it's rampant.
Right. It's cognitive dissonance, but it's also pathologizing. You see, the moment you challenge the logic of some of these people, they begin to tell you that you need help, that you're a POS.
Right.
There's all kinds of acronyms you get. This is pathologizing. But it's really a projection because the old saying, if it takes one to know one, that's kind of simpleton. But the reality is that is what it is. It's projection. They're experiencing their own pathologies more in the people with whom they are attacking than in themselves, which is a form of blame, really. And that is a thought disorder. So we have a lot of people with thinking disorders, which also explains the fact that the government has made its people dependent upon them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the shut up money, the close your businesses down, wear the masks, do as we say, not as we do, don't ask any questions, we gave you some dough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the hospitals are getting paid extra money for every COVID case they find. The states here in the United States get extra money from the federal government. The more cases they find, there's all kinds of reasons to find more COVID cases in terms of the financial benefits that you're going to get from it. And of course, this is going to affect those decision makers at the top, and then it trickles down to everybody at the bottom, where they think, oh, there must be so many COVID cases, But
if you knew that the business of the PCR business was going to launch, you might have thought about where you put your money.
Right. We need to find a list of congressmen and senators that invested in PCR tests 6 months ago. But Joseph, I want to get to this idea of science. How many members of the OCLA are scientists and how many are more liberal arts oriented? Is it mostly scientists, or what's the ratio there?
Yeah, I would say about half, and maybe even a little more than half in the core group of scientists.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, and the reason why I ask is because I've actually been most of these people that I'm dealing with, right, when I encounter this cognitive dissonance, and I'll be showing them peer-reviewed scientific papers, they don't want to look at it. They're not paying attention, But they say, well, science says that COVID is killing all of us and we need to lock down. And science says this, and I know that. And you're just being irrational if you don't listen to the science. And so, and also this other aspect of the argument is there's a consensus of scientists that say this. And if the scientific consensus says it, then it must be rational to follow what the consensus of scientists say. And so, I can speculate as to where this whole notion of like a consensus in science, because now I'm doing a lot of interviews with scientists every week that, they disagree with this quote unquote consensus. And I don't even know where the consensus comes from or what it is. But I think that's sort of, I mean, I consider it a mythology that the average person follows. They believe they're following the scientific evidence when they're going along with these government dictates. And it's just...
Yeah, I mean, you might as well replace it with religious dogma says,
right?
Science says.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
science, like, skepticism is supposed to be a virtue. You know, it's supposed to be like great if you can be skeptical and you know, you try to be objective and you recognize that it's like almost impossible to be objective, but you're always like trying to challenge yourself. Can I be more objective? You know, can I step back and reconsider whether I'm actually being objective here or not?
Right.
You know? That's
a very good point, because many people now, again, you know, dealing with the backward thinking, the backward wiring, being pessimistic is being realistic about what you're seeing. A lot of that going on. That people think the worse, you know, the worse they describe the situation to being, the more accurate they are in terms of rights violations. You got to remember, nobody's been sitting around talking about this stuff forever. It's been going on for us for the past 27 weeks. We have seen a prevalence in the arguments that we're getting from people online. At the protest, it is a nice, healthy break from that. People are able to connect with people who truly get what's going on. And what does this do? It highlights the backwardness that we're experiencing right now. And it does it in a very positive way, because people aren't attacking anybody. They're simply sharing truthful stories that any public member can go online and corroborate. And the more we do this kind of stuff, the more difficult it's becoming for these people to prevail. We're not seeing as many responses anymore, not as many. So the pushbacks are working, but we've got to continue. Cracks are formulating.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, your comments about science, Doug, made me remember a conversation I had recently with an activist and supporter of the OCLA, and we were talking about how, you know, how can you be neutral? You have to pick a side in these kind of things that are happening in society. And her comment was, you know, I can respect someone who is authentically neutral. You know, someone who says, yeah, I don't know. You know, it's not something I've studied. There's some concepts there that aren't clear to me. I don't understand them. I really don't know, you know, whether this is a dangerous virus, whether there is a virus, whether it's dangerous, whether it's more dangerous than previous years, whether these kind of viral respiratory illnesses are mostly transmitted by small particles, aerosols that float around in the air, or whether it's larger droplets, you know, that are subject to gravity. Well, that fall quickly to the ground.
Right.
Yeah, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a really open mind to form one's own position and decide for oneself, like, you know, what is the closest representation of reality based on the concepts and arguments that are out there and that I can think of myself, you know, and the evidence that's available. So I mean, it would be good if we had more people who are authentically neutral, rather than thinking that they know the other.
The know-it-all fools. They know-it-all fool role.
I think we're actually touching on a really important concept here. And I've had conversations with other independent journalists and interviewers like myself, and we'll often tell people, like, we'll tell our audience, you know, don't take our word for it. Please do your own research and come to your own conclusions. And it's actually a fundamentally different philosophy than if you're listening to a mainstream article where they're just like telling you this is how it is. And they never say, maybe it's different. Maybe I don't know. You know, I don't know all the facts, but this is what I'm seeing. This is the narrative, the best narrative I can construct based on the facts at hand, which is, I mean, that's just it. There's this level of humility, I think, that needs to be present in human beings, you know, for rational discourse to really move forward. And this really closed-mindedness that so many people have, where they can't even hear the opposing point of view, it's actually deadly to the concept of democracy or any kind of community,
all social
group working through a
responsibility.
problem.
Yeah,
Right?
all social responsibility is harmful to democracy, in my opinion. When you don't observe boundaries, you're not out to have the best conversation or debate that you possibly
Right.
can. This is about attacking. And I've always said, whether it's attacking, skills are lacking. If you haven't got the skill, you have to resort to attack. You're not going to be entering science into the equation. You don't have any. So you've got to do what you know how to do best, which is either smear, pathologize, or accuse.
Yeah.
Label. But none of those are valued exchanges. If you want to have a positive debate, again, I've invited people to come on out, get the microphone. It's, we're all for free speech. We're all for what you have to say. All you have to do is be willing to show up.
Right.
They don't show up because of what Joseph said. They're not neutral. They're not on our side. They're just simply like loyal parrots spouting a narrative that they have adopted from mainstream media or their friends who have adopted it from mainstream media. But everybody is feeding off the same trough of BS, if you like. They're all going to the same trough, so they all have the same narrative, they all have the same belief systems, and they call that unity.
Mm-hmm.
It's glorified dysfunction, in my opinion, social dysfunction, because it's all these people banding together, coalescing together out of insecurity, not knowledge. If they were secure, they'd be able to say, I'm willing to hear your side of it. Mm-hmm. I'm willing to be amendable to the new information or reasoned argument.
Right.
We're not seeing that stance. We are seeing people being attacked, and my page on Facebook is testimony to that fact.
Yeah, I know. I've been there. I've seen it.
Just yesterday, we invited the chair of the Board of Health here in Ottawa. So it's the top municipal board that governs the public health unit of the city. Invited him to a debate about the necessity and effectiveness of the mandatory mask policy that is implemented in the city here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is somebody who, says that he has considered many different sources, many different arguments on the topic of mandatory masks, and has considered critical research and still comes to the opinion that they're necessary. But he declined. He's not willing to defend his views against an opponent in a debate, where we said that the goal of the debate would be to help the public understand the city's position and on this policy and its basis.
Yeah.
So if you're so confident, you should be willing to stand up and publicly defend your position and explain it.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you're not willing to be subject to expert scrutiny, then obviously you can't be that confident about your position.
I've seen the same thing with the vaccine controversy, where people that are concerned about vaccine safety want to have debates with the people that are all about, following the vaccine schedule, and they just refuse to do it. And that should be a red flag, frankly. It's a red flag when you're not willing to publicly state why you think the way that you do and have a debate, a rational, reasonable debate with somebody who has a disagreement with you. I mean, come on.
The facts aren't friendly. They're not friendly facts.
Well, it seems like deep down they must know this. It's funny. And then I've heard, I don't even want to give their side. I don't want to give them the respect of having a debate. Yeah. I don't want to dignify them with the debate, but it's really just a cop out. I mean, they don't have answers to some of our questions, and so they're not willing to go public, knowing, or at least subconsciously being frightened that they're going to embarrass themselves, that they're going to be, really kind of proven wrong.
Cowardice versus real virtue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think anybody who's willing to hear both sides of the equation, anybody willing to do that is balanced. But the moment you have somebody who doesn't want to know, they only want you to hear their opinions. I mean, I've said many times to people online, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And a debate has to allow for both sides to be heard, equally so, but stick to the topic, stick to the subject matter, and don't attack people, attack the problem. but they don't really know the problem. So the only thing left to do when you say something that's in conflict with what they believe is to attack you, to attack credibility or who you are, where you come from. Something other than the problem gets the attention. Not useful, dysfunctional.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy the amount of discipline it takes to stay on topic and to stay within a reasonable discussion, and how few people are actually willing to take it to that level. It's fascinating. I mean, it should be what they teach in school, how to have rational conversations and think critically, but unfortunately, it seems like almost a lost art. Joseph, will you speak to this concept of the consensus in science? Because so many people think, well, if it's a consensus of science, then it must be true, and that's how I think, and I'm being rational if I think this way. And yet, I mean, we've already spoken a little bit, we've touched on this, but I mean, obviously, for science to progress, there's got to be a new idea. I mean, what is your experience in the scientific community? I imagine there's lots of scientists with lots of different ideas. I mean, you're each an individual. How does this idea even of a consensus, sit with you?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, you could say a consensus is an opportunity, or a claimed consensus is an opportunity to make a revolutionary discovery. Physicists typically in the first courses learn about how this is the story they tell. I don't even know if this is true, but how at the turn of the 1900s that the top physicists claimed that everything was basically solved, and there were a few small problems left. But we understood everything. And a few years later, Einstein came out with his amazing theory of special relativity, which just completely changed our idea of space and time, right?
yeah, absolutely. And it's this one guy. No consensus going, right? It's like,
he was somebody who was able to tie together a few different concepts that a few other scientists had put forward in the years before him, and have this brilliant spark that linked it together. Opened a new door on our picture, on our idea of reality. And that was in a time when the top scientists would have said, his supervisor would have told him that what he was doing was pure speculation, and he can't do that. And everyone knows that, there's a consensus that we understand movement in the world, and Newtonian mechanics is all we need to know, basically. So, I think a consensus is it should be looked at as with skepticism. It's the idea that so many scientists agree on something raises a question of who are the few that don't agree, and why don't they agree? You immediately start to look at who are the dissenters.
Yeah.
And that's say, well, what do they think? And so it gives you it's interesting because it gives you a debate between two schools of thought, which can always be interesting. Because the way that new discoveries are made is often through conflict. I think it's what they call the dialectic, creative destruction, or the conflict of two opposing ideas that leads to the creation of something new. So a consensus gives you that opportunity,
right? Well, and also but the truth, or at least progressing towards the truth, is what's occurring in the conflict between the consensus and then the outsiders. That's just it. You have to actually, if you believe in this process, you have to give as much credit to the outsiders who are thinking against the consensus as you do to the consensus for creating this opportunity for the expansion of human knowledge through the scientific process, that's why I just think it's so fascinating.
You weight the two claims equally. One claim has, 97% of scientists. So they say. Okay, so that's one claim, and then on the other side, there's another claim. You weight them equally, and you try to think about, well, does it make sense or not, and why not? And
it's just interesting because I've been speaking with so many scientists that are in that 3% number that you're talking about. I'm talking to people. Right now, for whatever reason, it's become kind of the thing for people. With COVID coming on, some people are doubting the viral theory altogether. And, throughout the internet, there's this conversation about whether terrain theory is actually more applicable to how disease happen. And I'm telling you, I'm talking to people that are on the cutting edge of science, coming up with
Judy.
theories that are, yeah, I mean, a Judy Mikovits or a Dr. Stephanie Seneff, or a Dr. Tom Cowan, that I've actually spoken to these people. And they're blowing my mind with how, I mean, obviously they have an intelligent perspective and they have a new point of view, so that people can just blow it off as those people are just crazy people. I mean, it boggles my mind. And when they can't actually, when they're not engaging in that rational conversation about, well, here's what the consensus says, here's the answer to your skepticism. If they're not providing that answer and engaging in this rational conversation, well, something is up. Like, people are just afraid that maybe their belief system's not as accurate as they thought it was,
Yeah, sometimes people will say we need a consensus because we need to take action quickly, because there's a great threat
Mm-hmm.
to society, right? So we need to act right away. I mean, another side would say that a perceived crisis is not the time for rash action. That you need to consider many different sides of the debate and what's going on, and make sure that you don't make a rash mistake, by taking a dramatic action that might not be necessary.
Right.
You might rush the whole herd off a cliff. So.
Well, and let's apply. I don't want to go on too long here, but let's just take a few minutes to apply this to your letter to the World Health Organization, where you clearly delineate, here's your arguments for the mask wearing, and here's our concerns about the mask wearing. I mean, you talked about confirmation bias in the scientific testing, and this is something that I've seen over and over again. We just had this huge hydroxychloroquine debate, and I've seen this. I've seen it happen in the vaccine debate. I've seen it happen in other things where they'll construct studies that sort of have this built-in confirmation bias, and then they'll go, see here, we were right. And it's like, well, you didn't actually have a control group, or you didn't follow in the hydroxychloroquine situation, they didn't follow the protocols that were working. They would double or triple the dose of hydroxychloroquine and go, see, it's dangerous. It's like, well, yeah, everybody knew that was dangerous before you started, if you were going to give it to them at that level. So, do you want to speak to, for example, maybe like how some of these mass studies have this built-in confirmation bias already? Once the lockdowns were imposed, they're sort of constructing these scientific studies to justify what they've done, and they might not actually be, they might not be using the best science.
Yeah, the main argument of our letter to the WHO is the same argument that the WHO always used up until June 2020. It's that there is a standard for scientific evidence that can be used to promote public policy. There's a threshold of study. You can't just use any paper that's published in a peer-reviewed journal. It has to be a certain type of study. It's called a randomized controlled trial with laboratory verified infections. And many of those have been done over the past few decades. And none of them have ever found a statistically significant positive benefit to wearing a mask for these types of illnesses. So, and the WHO knows that, and they've always had that position. The science didn't change. Around June of 2020, they just changed their position. So that's the main thrust of our letter, is that we're really trying to argue that you need to have this threshold. It's to prevent certain types of biases that can arise in these studies. That's why the gold standard has always been randomized controlled trials. And there's many of them, and they're just ignoring them now, basically. Yeah. And so it's important because the media and the politicians will try to heap together all kinds of peer-reviewed articles and say, here, look, there's evidence. The evidence is pointing towards something. No, I mean, with public health policy, there's a standard, and you throw out the stuff that's below the standard, the threshold, and you keep the stuff that's above, and you use that as the basis of whether you implement the policy or not. And this is well known. So, I mean, we're just saying basically what the WHO would have said last year.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and then you have the list of the studies that actually can show that. I mean, and this is just the thing. It's like most people aren't getting the opposing information. There's other studies out there that shows that mask wearing is dangerous. That if you wear a mask for a long period of time, then you have an opportunity to actually culture more viral material in the mask, more bacteria in the mask that can lead to respiratory infections and other inflammation-based diseases. And
but you don't need that. You don't need that to say that you should not have mandatory masks, right? Because imposing mandatory masks is it's an action. It's a positive action.
Sure.
To do that, you need to have some reliable evidence that there's a positive benefit to doing that. So you actually don't, as a critic of these policies, you don't need to show that there are studies showing significant negative effect. Although I am aware of one randomized controlled trial from a few years ago, I think it was 2015 or 2016, that did show a negative effect of wearing a fabric face mask, more infections, in other words. So, but I think the important point here is that it's actually not even relevant. It doesn't matter because they're trying to impose something. So the onus is on them. The onus is on the policymaker that wants to impose the mandatory mask to show that there's a positive benefit, and that benefit outweighs the risk.
Right.
At least they violate Section 1 of our rights code, which the lacking of such scientific support is allowing for. So what we got arrested for exactly the opposite. What Joseph's saying is it being considered by the officials who are supposed to be upholding these mandates. In fact, they don't even know what they're upholding. So they convert it into a Trespass to Property Act charge since they have no jurisdiction over the mask mandates. And the moment they're challenged with science, well, that kind of deflates their balloon. So they have to turn it into something they can enforce, which is the Property to Trespass Act. That ends the discussion about masking. And your Section 1 rights are violated.
And what is Section 1 for those of us in the United States?
Well, it deals with freedom of speech, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, disability, creed, race, color, religion. It covers a whole slew of stuff. But go ahead.
Yeah, let me just jump in there. It's so we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Okay.
It's like the Constitution in the United States, except that unlike the Constitution in the U.S., we have this special section. It's the very first one, right at the top of the document, that says the government can just override all of these rights that we're going to
right.
The document, right? So the U.S. doesn't have that. Canada has it, and some Western European countries have it. But yes, the first section is you have these rights unless the government decides to throw them away.
Right.
But to do that, they have to show that it's necessary. They have to show that it's reasonable. There's a test for that, whether they can do that or not. Well, and so that's what I think George is getting at, is that to violate freedom of all the freedoms that are listed in the rest of the Charter, the government should be showing its evidence, all of its evidence. It has to prove to the public that it's necessary to override the fundamental rights.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, that's how they're circumventing everything here, too, is that over the years, slowly, state governments and even on the federal level, they've been talking about, well, what if there's a state of emergency? And, it's just gotten to the point where now the executive branches of the state and the federal government can just claim a state of emergency, and then there go all of our rights, too. They're using the same old argument, to say, well, we know best, it's a state of emergency, and we're really not. I mean, they're not entitled to go in front of the people and say, no, here's why it's a state of emergency, here's what's going on. I mean, here in California, theoretically, after 60 days, The legislature is supposed to have the ability to tell them it's not a state of emergency anymore. But the governor so far has just been reimposing the state of emergency, and there hasn't been any debate on the floor of any legislature, as far as I know, why we should keep this up. So it's actually quite amazing that they've been able to circumvent our Constitution and Bill of Rights using this concept and really having very little pushback. I mean, I'm just flabbergasted. That's why I'm so interested in the whole cognitive dissonance concept and what's going on with people and why are they not even in the least bit concerned. I had a conversation with a friend of mine when the lockdowns happened 6 months ago. Like, they're just taking away our freedom of assembly. There wasn't a peep in the press. There wasn't a single conversation anywhere about, like, maybe we should have a conversation about this before they do it. No, it was all just, scaring the crap out of us about how dangerous COVID was, none of which was ever scientifically verified and never came to pass. As far as I know, in terms of the bell curves of all the infections that have happened, they've all followed the same, I think it's called Farr's law of epidemiology, where this is how virus spread always occurs according to this curve. None of the curves have been flattened anywhere, and yet people are still convinced that we have to be in lockdown.
Well, Rocco's already, Rocco's pointed out on a few occasions.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, Parliament's neutered, so are the courts, and we have a government operating under royal prerogative, which has been illegal since 1689. I checked this out myself. And right now, we have a lot of arbitrary decisions being made. The other thing I discovered is, further to what Joseph said, is the reason why the police are not, when called to enforce the mask, they convene with the owner of the establishment and get them to agree that it's a trespass call. This is why video cameras are very important, to show the reason for the attention at that point. When in fact, if I'm not mistaken, under the rules, there is no other law that trumps the Human Rights Code. Despite what it's, Joseph, you mentioned something about the Charter. There's the Charter of Rights, and then there's the Human Rights Code. And my understanding is the Human Rights Code is superior above all. There's nothing you can do. And since there's this conflict, as Joseph mentioned, they haven't shown the standard. They haven't not met the standard, gold or otherwise, in terms of proving to us that there is a scientific basis for these mask mandates. And since they can't do that, and that is, almost old knowledge now, in my opinion, that they cannot achieve that level of evidence, they now are faced with having to alter the reason for calling the police to enforce what the police themselves know would land up being unenforceable. It would not prevail.
George, were you charged with the trespass or someone in that event? Like, was there actually a trespass notice given?
I love that question because if you remember, Rob Ford said it's going to be $800 if you're showing up. So you are an activist. It's going to be $100,000 for the organizers and $10,000, I think, for a business that opens. And I could be wrong about those numbers, by the way, so please don't quote me. But they're up there. Mm-hmm. And we said to the police when they arrested us at Hilton, Toronto, so we're going to go outside and you're going to give us a ticket. I have this on video. No, they don't want to give us tickets. We want the tickets. We need the ticket. We need to put the judges down.
That would be a ticket under the mandatory mask bylaw or order, right?
Yes.
The trespass ticket would be a different ticket.
Correct. They didn't give us that. Both, in my opinion, would be incriminating. Our lawyers, our legal team seem to agree.
Because if you had the trespass ticket, then you could start seeing how to attack it and whether you would go through the Human Rights Code or some other.
No. The police don't. It seems to me that the police don't want to be implicated in and handing out a ticket is a record of that of that transaction, because now the police are drawn into discrimination as well.
Interesting. Like, actually, the police, I mean, isn't this funny to see that you are actually trying to draw yourself? And I want to finish up here with a conversation about the strategy and strategies that we're trying to combat this with. But the cops are like, they know it's going to be so much paperwork. They know that you're ready to fight. I mean, most of the time they hand out a ticket, right? You go to court,
40,
you pay a ticket.
48 minutes, 48 minutes. 5 of our team in a hotel in Toronto, 145 Richmond Street West, with the police, 3 of them, and including a sergeant, who I felt wanted to be the poster boy of human rights violations, would not give us the ticket regardless of the level of resistance we offered up, including our question, are you going to use force now?
Right.
We don't want to use force. We don't, okay, so we're not leaving.
Yeah.
We have a right to be here. We have broken no laws. We're not leaving. Falls in your court, your serve. And I got through one of the cops who said, I'm not touching anybody. I'm here to keep the peace. Well, then you better call your sergeant, because you have a manager over there right now that you guys are enabling to violate our rights. And that is abhorrent. You swore an oath to uphold the very Constitution. You are now enabling a vindictive manager who we challenged appropriately under the law to successfully violating. So if that's your collaboration, then, and people don't resist that, that is of grave danger to every single person in this country. If one person is allowed to have that done to them, every person is experiencing a ripple effect, and they better know it, because apparently they're not using force. They're not out to, they're not out to deceive us anymore. They are using force. They are saying, we're going to show up and your rights are going to be violated. It's that simple. Not complex. And therefore, we wanted to get the most out of the experience we could. If you're going to arrest us, make sure we get the ticket, because Dougie's telling you to do it. And don't forget, we're the group that told your boss, Tory, not to defund you. But now you want to breach our rights. As a matter of fact, when the police officer showed up, when the sergeant showed up, the first police officer, who didn't want to touch us, said, these are the guys over here. They do the demonstration at Dundas Square every Saturday.
Right.
That was his first line. No pun intended. And
you're not wearing a mask at the restaurant at the Hilton. Is that what's happening? And the manager calls the cops, and now.
Well, we called. As a matter of fact, one of our team called to verify that mask exemptions were in effect. She was told that they are. It's on my reservation. It's written right on my reservation, mask exempt, sent in. And when I got there, listen, that was only the Hilton. I was also at the Sheraton Toronto, where also my wife put on my reservation that I was exempt. So when I got down there, they said, we're not going to fulfill your reservation. Please leave. So, I mean, I had to go to 3 hotels before we found one.
Right.
So, the whole scenario was replayed at the Hilton, where another manager who took our money, took our credit cards, et cetera, et cetera. The reservation was complete. We were sitting, having dinner, having a meeting, talking about the event the following day. And the same manager then came up. I guess he had a change of heart and told us we all had to wear masks. Well, I was confused. I said, what's the problem? We just had this conversation upon arrival and things were okay. Your establishment advised us that mask exemptions are in effect. Now they're not in effect. So we're making this up as we go along. We're just going to change things on the fly. And the next thing you know, we've got 3 cops in our faces. And we held them to lawful conversation for 48 minutes. So had we been actually doing anything wrong, we would have been removed long before 48 minutes. I assure you of that.
Did you get the ticket in the end? Are you going to be able to? Are you going to go to court? You're not going to be able to go to court after that.
We are suing them. Yes, we are suing them. Absolutely, 100%.
Okay.
We're suing all of them. All
You
the
keep having
establishments.
bigger rallies, and then they'll come.
Say that again?
If you keep just having bigger rallies, I think eventually you'll get your chance.
Well, yeah, I mean, the traction's there, right? I mean, the people are out there exposing what we're trying to do now. It's kind of taken on a life of its own, which is a wonderful thing to see, that we're getting through to some people. So yeah, and now other groups, you know, such as the OCLA.
Kind of the silver lining to all of this, in a sense, is like, I mean, we entered this dystopian horror movie with the masks and the lockdown and social distancing and everything so quickly that it's like, I think it shows that the state was already in something very close to, or something very far from democracy, closer to totalitarianism already for a long time.
Right.
But there's not a lot of people that were aware of this. Now, I think that, you know, it's unavoidable, and there are a lot of people who are thirsty for meaning in life, and in this case to find a way to have some influence and contribute to rolling this back and changing this. So I think it's a bit of a silver lining, in a sense, is that this is just so extreme that basically everyone is now aware of, or at least confronted with. They might react differently, but they're confronted with this very undemocratic state that we're in. So there's chance for much stronger resistance and rebellion against injustice than there was before this happened.
Right. I think one of the interesting things, and I know in my own area, we were probably 3 months into all this, and one restaurant was like, screw it, we don't care. You know, we're going to open up. We're tired of losing money. We're going to lose our business if we don't, you know, we're going to open up. We don't care about the masks. Anybody can come. And, you know, the people in the community start freaking out. My God, this restaurant's open. And then one of the most fascinating things that happened was they realized that there was no enforcement mechanism, that literally the only enforcement mechanism had been this peer pressure that had been imposed on everyone to do what they were told. And so our local government had to pass a specific ordinance for this specific place to say, we're going to fine them $10,000 and we're going to shut them down, because they had to become the enforcement mechanism. And it was almost like, it's just so strange that the community itself was doing the self-policing. Like it was creating this totalitarian state without the state having to be totalitarian, with just the state scaring them enough to get them all to do what they were told. I mean, it's just so fascinating. And then over time now, like George, you're telling me this story, you're trying to get arrested because you want to go to court. And this is a great angle for nonviolent resistance to this kind of thing. And they're even hesitant. They don't even want to deal with it. They're not
even giving you an incident number.
Yeah, right. I mean, how fascinating. And it's like, I think, I agree with you, Joseph. More and more people have to start going like, what's really going on? I mean, it's more of a psychological operation than it even is, a totalitarian regime. They don't have to put the boot on your neck. They just, have to come up with a really scary virus and
you see the guilt of these people. They're pitting people against one another. Guilt is about doing. Shame is about being.
Right.
So you're getting these people who are partnering with the government, and they're guilting you. Basically, what they're saying is what you're doing is wrong. You should be wearing a mask. And this is we're seeing virtue signaling. We're seeing people who think that they are entitled. I was at the grocery store and a lady 40 feet away going, "Where's your mask?" I'm like,
right, chasing
wearing a mask. Well, you are, and this odd behavior where people think it's okay to violate your rights because Doug Ford said, if you see these people without a mask, you make sure you tell them. And he said that something to that effect in one of his recent interviews. Mm-hmm. So that to me is pitting people against them. It's the non-mask wearers versus the mask wearers. Listen, we're not, people keep calling us anti-maskers. We're not anti-anything. We're just anti-stupid.
Right.
And they don't like that. They don't like that we're challenging the stupidity of what they believe. And failing any science coming forward, again, you're going to get attacked. It is the same patternistic thing. And since, we've got this thing called the social construction of reality, and what we're living in right now is unreality. Human beings are creatures of habit. Mm-hmm. So the government has habitually told these people, fear-inducing ideas, constantly waving cases in our face, and some people are very susceptible to that. In fact, I would say most people are. We are the minority. The correct ones are the minority. The people who see the lack of science, who understand that the state of emergency did not meet, for 10 provinces, the criteria of what is required to introduce a state or announce a state of emergency. So people are asking questions about legislation, rules, policy, laws, etc., that they've never had to ask before. If you bring in a woman from former Soviet Union or wherever communism is or was, for them, it's the same thing as us talking about the weather. They know what it's like to live under a communist society. Mm-hmm. And here, the Canadian people, they just can't get there. It's outside of their normal perceptual
well, that's just what's so
that's
crazy. I think it looks like this, right? This looks like the lockdowns, and people don't, they don't know that they're actually inviting the totalitarianism in, and they're not standing up against it. It's just amazing.
Your silence is your consent. I think that's what that generally means. It's like, it's, people are afraid to say anything. Well, again, we go back to the doctor and the police officer, both who handed in their occupational positions to adhere to truth and reality and humanness. That doesn't, people say, well, it's only 2. Well, hang on a second here. You have these other people who don't disagree, but they're afraid of losing reputation or economies or hurting their families or speaking out to a point where it could be threatening to them. There's a host of reasons why people don't want to say anything, but I don't think this is the time for the silent majority to remain silent. If anything, we've got a lot of momentum right now. They've got to wake up and speak out.
Yeah. Something that's really encouraging, you see this in like some of the responses by politicians to people's letters against opposing the mandatory mask policies, is the politicians will respond things like, everybody has to wear a mask or else people will start to question whether it's necessary. And if there's only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people not wearing a mask, then that's enough to, cause more to not wear it either and not comply, right? So it's pretty encouraging that if politicians that are making the laws, that's actually going through their head and that's part of their decision, I think that might be true. That might be the case, right? So that's an encouraging thing, that there could be a domino effect that's possible. So it doesn't take a very large nucleus of resistors to make some significant change. And the other thing that's kind of encouraging, if you look at it a certain way, is that they have to use fines, significant fines. And so in a sense, this is just anecdotal, but it seemed to me that when they were introducing the lockdown measures and social distancing measures back in March, that people would obey up to the point of a fine. And then they would kind of just ignore the other recommendations. At least a large portion of this is just me observing things, and other people have said similar things. But it's, and then gradually the government had to impose actual concrete fines. And then that's when immediately people's behavior would change. So I found that kind of interesting. It's also disheartening that it's so easy to control the population by just announcing that there will be a fine that even, if you think about it, it would be almost impossible to enforce. But but that's where we're at. That's where we're at right now. So at least it's not necessarily, I don't think, it's not necessarily a fear of the virus that is causing people to obey these rules. I tend to think it's more the actual, we were trained, we've, grown up in a society where you don't want to break the rules, basically. And once it becomes clear with the backing of a fine what the rule is, then you 100% comply. That's the kind of society that
Right.
Sorry.
Well, I'll just say I've had the same experience as the months passed, and I would deal with individuals, one-on-one, because it's like sort of like when you get into when you're in a massive group, almost everybody wants to wear their masks, whatever, because they're afraid about what other people are going to do. But when you get people one-on-one, it was interesting to me to see what their responses were. Like, how much were they going to sort of self-impose on themselves, wearing the mask with just one other person standing there, and eventually I came to the conclusion that it didn't have to do with the virus or the facts about the virus. It was entirely their relationship with authority. If they didn't trust authority, then people were like, hey, they were always happy if I didn't need them to wear a mask or want them to wear the mask, and they could just kind of be more casual.
I want to get back to something Joseph said earlier about punishment. If you remember in the very beginning, Premier Doug Ford said, I don't want to go punishing the businesses and turn them into criminals. We trust that you're going to follow the mandate, the regulations, whatever. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then when they started to realize that people weren't thrilled about that idea and were resisting, remember, Yahoo Nation was born. Just a bunch of yahoos. A couple of hundred yahoos are causing this problem. But, things were okay over the weekend except for a bunch of yahoos. Then the punishments started because they started to realize people weren't afraid enough about the repercussions. And that was a smaller segment at one point. So when that segment started to grow, then you saw the intensity of the measures being increased.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
that was the government's response
with the media slander and defamation campaign. The smearing.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how this propaganda wave kind of has these different sections that play off one another. So it's like the media will be starting to smear conspiracy theorists, and then the government introduces a hard, concrete fine, and then that allows the media to be bolder and to come down even harder and defame even more strongly.
Right.
Who would resist. So these things, and the institutions are part of this fabric as well, the health and the other policy institutions. And they're kind of like, they're watching each other's move and then making the next move, and it kind of, it all goes together and points in one direction.
Well, and now we're seeing the censorship on these third-party platforms, the Twitters and the YouTubes and the Facebook, just going through the roof. I mean, that's what I've seen, and maybe from my vantage point as a media producer, but it's gotten, as this has gone on longer, they've come down harder and harder and harder on those of us who are trying to have conversations like this one. So it's funny. It's almost like the government's not the one, it's these social media companies.
They just got called. I believe they got called to testify. The president of Twitter, the president of YouTube and Facebook, all three of them, if I'm not mistaken,
mm-hmm.
that's got called to testify because it's out of control. I mean, this is not this. I don't call it censorship. To me, censorship is eliminating harmful content that can mislead people, provably mislead people, and dangerously harm the belief systems and decisions, and therefore the decisions people will make. That is valid censorship. Or if it's a form of corruption that could damage the minds of children who could inadvertently contact this information. What we're actually seeing is not censorship. In fact, it is collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
They're playing a partnering role in suppressing provable scientific data and expert scrutiny, hence collaboration. They don't want that expert scrutiny. So you're seeing a lot of things on Facebook being tagged as false, which are in fact true, which is why I say it's not censorship. It's collaboration. They're working to do this together.
Yeah.
To suppress and make sure we don't have access to the data that puts their credibility and questions our credibility in broad daylight.
Censorship is the state silencing certain pieces of information, making it disappear, or not allowing it to be expressed and put out there. And we're in a state where corporations are extremely powerful, more powerful than the government at the end of the day. Some corporations. And so it's
corporatocracy.
corporate censorship, when the corporation is a monopoly of a form of expression, like is this case with Facebook and Twitter and so on, and Google, is state censorship. It's the same thing.
Right. Especially when you take into account that all these companies have massive government contracts and have benefited from a tight relationship with the government in terms of limiting competition, and then getting, again, these government contracts that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, which also, place them at a huge advantage over any competitors that aren't getting those kind of lucrative contracts or subsidies. I mean, I just have started to call it the government corporate complex, because to me, as George was saying, it's really collusion. And then the government can say, well, the corporations are doing it, but it's not the government, so they can censor whatever they want. But it's like, yeah, but without the government, they would never have gotten this big or been able to monopolize in this way. Or I don't even know if we'd have a centralized internet.
The creation of the internet and the infrastructure of the internet is largely public, from public
right.
public funds, and they these corporations are making use of that, but then they're allowed to defy the constitutional rights
right
the government is supposed to uphold. So it's not right. It's censorship. It's state censorship, and it totally should not be allowed, and it has to be rolled back big time.
Well, gentlemen, we're looking at, we've crossed over the 90-minute mark. I think we probably should close it off. If you have some closing statements, we touched a little bit on the strategies and talked about, basically trying to get arrested so that you can, actually get something in court, and trying to set these precedents in court that this stuff is unconstitutional or violates these basic human rights. But having more and more rallies, it's exciting for me to hear that you're doing this every weekend, because I think being consistent and getting more and more and more people over time, it's just, that's what's going to happen, and it's got to grow. It's got to grow, and we've got to be getting the word out. So
we're not trying to get arrested.
Right.
we went the road on civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. That's what we did. When they arrested us, that presented the opportunity to say, hey, where's the ticket? So we're not actively out there seeking to be arrested, albeit the fact you've heard Doug Ford and Tory say, there will be fines. None of us have received fines. Well, one person from Hugs Over Masks, which is Chris Sky, mm-hmm. He's made a good name for himself. He's taken a few on the chin, and he's making himself a hero in some ways, because he's really stood up to these guys. I mean, they've been knocking on his door. They know when he shows up to the rally. So, I mean, he called them out, but they put the ticket in his wrong name. Now he has to be in court, I think, November 9th.
Okay.
To prove that he didn't violate the Quarantine Act. Well, that there's going to be a hodgepodge of science that there will be called upon, I'm certain, if the arresting officers are to prevail. I highly doubt that's going to be the case. However, it's creating a lot of controversy, which we need out there right now, because these kind of situations get people to take a look and see, well, what is the truth here now?
Right.
See, these offers the impetus for people to look further into this, because now people are getting arrested, and some of them are laughing, and then a little chagrined, realizing upon the research, there is no basis to arrest anyone for exercising, defending the integrity of their human rights whatsoever, or any other group who does do that and has the courage to do it.
And that's just the fascinating thing. Like, we've gotten to this place where you actually, in a court of law is where they have to listen to your argument. So, I mean, nobody seems to be listening out in the world where we're encountering, like we've discussed, this cognitive dissonance, but at least if we can get them into a courtroom where on the record we can kind of go down the list, then they have to pay attention to the science. And so hopefully,
you can put it on the record, but they won't listen to your argument.
Yeah.
Sorry, what?
They won't listen to your argument in court. You can if you're lucky, you can make the argument.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't let you do that.
If they don't squash the case,
the only thing that's going to make them listen to the argument is if there's enough public opinion behind you.
So
if there's no public opinion, there's no public support, they just won't even listen to it. They might not even let you make the argument.
Yeah.
If there's a section of the society that is actually on your side, that changes the game. So the court of public opinion is most important.
Right. Interesting. So, a combination of legal action with the rallies and the organizations to get numbers.
The whole fabric of everything that's happening, and starting with individuals, saying, how can I find some courage, be confident, and do the right thing in my own life? And it all starts there. And if it can take root in the society, then the institutions have to respond to some degree, including the courts.
Absolutely. This to me, and what Denny Rancourt and I were talking about the other day, and Joseph, I'm sure you'll agree. Legal recourse without support falls on deaf ears. You can go through the motions, you may not prevail. This is what creates the basis for these grassroots initiatives. Because once you've established a vast group of people who are willing to be the court of public opinion, at that point, as we have done, as the line has done recently, I just installed the collective legal action. So now is the time for us to introduce legal, because we've got some traction and we have enough people that are interested in doing that. The courts can't ignore that.
Yeah.
As they could if you have no grassroots initiatives to support your legal standing, even if you're right.
And I just want to add that I totally agree with that, but I just want to add that court action is part of what can create the public opinion. So it's not to say that you should wait until you have some mass of people that are supporting you before you ever actually. Right. I think everyone has to decide what's right for them, and using the court system and going to court and learning the law and standing up for yourself and defending yourself is very important. It's a vital part of this effort to push back, for sure.
Definitely. And you've got to use the judiciary effectively now. I totally agree with Joseph. If you're, Gandhi said, if you're the minority of one person, speak your truth. The truth is the truth. I totally agree. It's very comforting to have a large group of people who believe in what you're saying to them and who could probably finish some of your statements, even though we're the people doing this work. There are all of those people in that area that are showing up to our protests. Generally, to some degree, all believe, all know, all see the same things. All of them. If you look at the people who are opposing us, by contrast, they don't all believe the same things. There are different pockets of people. Mm-hmm. Anti-maskers. Some are like, well, this is the Russian thing, or something that's totally unrelated. Is what they're seeing going on. To us, properly understood, Rocco's statement of claim captures this handsomely well in his declarations, where he shows the sections of law being violated, and he shows what the ulterior motives are, and the media corroborates that.
Yeah. I
don't think there's any ambivalence. If anybody is still talking about a virus today, they're stuck in May.
Right.
What's happened now is there's sufficient outpouring, a sufficient amount of people, scientists from all over the world, thousands, that are now saying, no, you guys are not telling your people the truth. And everyone's acting like fancy, fancy what the prince is wearing. The prince has no clothes, fancy what he's wearing.
Yeah.
And we're coming up there going, look, he's naked. So they don't like that. They don't like this pushback. We're getting, slammed by Tory and slammed by Doug because we're giving them a run for their money. Doug was just on the news whining that he doesn't want people showing up at his house for protesting. Well, what is the bigger faux pas here, Doug? That you're lying to your Canadian people. We voted you in, and you've betrayed our trust. That you won't tell us that you're in bed with these oligarchs, that you're following their roadmap, their mission, their beliefs, their wants and desires that are expected of you. But he doesn't want you showing up at his house to remind him that he's doing that because the neighbors are bothered.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Well, gentlemen, I think we better wrap it up. It's been almost 2 hours now, but I definitely appreciate you coming on, and we'll keep in touch because I want to keep following this story. I'm so happy to see that up there in Canada, we've got some organizations that are really doing this level of work. I think here in the United States, we're at least a couple of months behind you guys, and I hope that we can start seeing more organizations starting here because it's absolutely necessary that people start to stand up against this. I mean, the longer this goes on, the more emboldened this totalitarianism and the people that are producing it, projecting it onto the rest of us are going to become. And so it's just more and more important that people stand up. So again, thank you so much for your work, and thanks for coming on to explain to my audience what's happening and helping to strategize in the big picture in terms of what people can do to stand up against this. So do you want to give people your contact information so they can find out more about your organization, and maybe we'll attract a few more people to those protests up there in Toronto? Joseph?
Sure. The Ontario Civil Liberties Association website is ocla.ca, and we're on Twitter, ONCIVLIB, on CivLib, and we have a Facebook group as well, Ontario Civil Liberties Association. For now, it's been disappeared in the past over the summer,
right.
And we'll see what happens.
All
Thanks
right,
a lot, Doug.
Yeah, you bet, Joseph. Thanks for coming on. And George, where can people find out more about the line?
Get us on on Twitter at The Line Media, The Line Canada on Facebook, and also our secondary main page at The Line Canada on Twitter again, and thelineinternational.com. Check out our action page. Don't forget. Check out our page on Facebook for black and white listed restaurants and businesses who are violating your rights, so you can see what we're doing about that. And if you haven't joined our membership for Pro Bono Legal, which we will be hitting hard next week, make sure to email us at the line legal at the line legal at the line Canada, legal at thelincanada.com. If you're interested in joining the fight to hold these businesses and institutions accountable who have licensed businesses in these areas that are willfully practicing medicine without licenses and attempting to breach your rights, we have a new initiative to band all the people together seeking justice. So make sure, if you haven't got a membership, you get us at legal at thelincanada.com. And we look forward to doing a lot more work with the OCLA.
Yep, sounds great, guys. Again, really happy about the work that you're doing, and thanks a lot for letting me cover it. And we'll keep in touch so that I can let my audience know what's happening up there into the future. I wish you all the luck. And hopefully here in the U.S., like I said, maybe we'll take a few cues and start to organize a little bit more ourselves. So you guys have a great week, and thanks again. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was a great conversation between myself, George Roche, and Dr. Joseph Hickey. We wanted to get those guys together. It was actually George's idea. The OCLA has endorsed formally the work of the line, so they're up there in Ontario trying to make something happen, trying to raise awareness, and they had a great weekend last weekend. George and the line have been putting on these rallies in Toronto every week, every weekend. I believe they've been going for 8 weeks running, and last weekend they had apparently about 8,000 people show up. So starting to grow, starting to gain some steam. I think a lot of people getting tired of having to deal with all of this. Like I said in the introduction, the CDC has come out with a 0.14% infection fatality rate for this thing, which is just above the flu, though they admit that most of those deaths are over 70, people aged over 70. So all of us of working age, when you do the numbers, the COVID thing is actually much less deadly than the flu, and it just seems like the amount of damage that they're doing to the economy doesn't reflect the danger posed by this virus. We've got 30 to 40 million people in the United States that are on the verge of losing their houses. The only reason why all 10% of the population hasn't been evicted so far is because the CDC actually had to intervene and say it was a national health crisis and make it illegal to evict people. But we're looking at a 10% homelessness crisis. We're seeing the food banks overrun every week. We've seen 8 million people driven into poverty. The world numbers, according to the World Health Organization and the United Nations, are out of control. 300 to 400 million. 4 million children are going to suffer from wasting disease that's near starvation next year as a result of the lockdown measures for a disease that has so far killed 220,000 people here in the United States, according to the official numbers. Though, again, many of those people had already lived longer than the life expectancy in the United States. So we have people that are getting this virus, of course, very, very elderly and passing away, and they're counting this as a COVID death, something, by the way, that they've never done before in the history of any other pandemic. In fact, and maybe I'll try to remember, well, it's been posted up on The Shift with Doug McKenty on Facebook, is the peer-reviewed scientific study that came out yesterday actually deemed it illegal the way they changed the counting methodology for COVID last March. They were supposed to go through official channels and be clear that these are the reasons why they were changing the protocol for counting deaths for COVID compared to, say, deaths for H1N1 in 2009. They did not do that. The powers that be just sleight of hand change the system, change the way that they're counting this thing, and making it appear like it's way worse than it actually is. I'm not discounting the fact that people are getting sick and that many people are dying from this disease. I'm just saying that people die from disease every day, and we don't shut down the economy, and we don't force 10% of the population out of their homes into the streets. We don't force millions of people into poverty as a result of some of us catching a disease and then unfortunately passing away. People are getting sick of it. That's why I was excited to have George on. He brought Joseph, and I was really happy to get to know about this Ontario Civil Liberties Association. I've been feeling, much like Joseph said, that the typical civil liberties associations, the establishment associations, have not been standing up against this. We have the ACLU here in the United States. I've been waiting to see what they would do in terms of allowing these governments to have these emergency powers, these governors to call an emergency, a state of emergency, and then essentially have dictatorial power over the state. Here in California, we're having a serious problem. We essentially no longer have a democracy, and there is a lawsuit against Gavin Newsom, and we'll see how that goes. Unfortunately, these things take time, and the longer, of course, that we're dealing with the lockdown, the more people are going to be impoverished. The higher the suicide rates, the higher the drug addiction rates, the higher the domestic violence rates, all of which are going through the roof as a result of the anxiety felt by the economic pressures put on all of us. And as Joseph was saying, you know, it was nice to have the comparison and contrast actually between George, who, if you see my episode with him, my interview with him, where we really went deep into the psychology behind all of this, with Joseph, we were able to add to that conversation by really diving into the fact that people aren't even letting us talk about it. The Last American Vagabond just got booted off YouTube last week, along with many, many other sites. Very clearly, there's a censorship campaign. I think the only reason why I'm still on YouTube is because I'm heavily shadow banned. They give me absolutely zero distribution, so I can say whatever I want. It's not going to get seen by anybody anyway. And so we have a serious problem. I did a show a few months ago now with Mark Jeftovic about the cancel culture. And good to see the OCLA really standing up against this, because it's especially pertinent if you're in academia. These people are not allowed to speak up. Sometimes I'm hearing stories of students, if you talk about your views, if you believe in freedom of speech, if you want to stand up for the right of people to make choices about healthcare, personal healthcare decisions for themselves, not just following the state diktats. Sometimes students will tell on them to the administration. The administration can have them fired. So, we're on the verge, if not fully over the edge, of a Nazi Germany type situation here. And so few people are even awake to what's going on. Just like in Nazi Germany, everybody's just doing their job, got their head in the sand, not paying attention. Hey, they're just censoring those crazy conspiracy theorists. Oh, I think those guys are white supremacists anyway. They probably should be. Oh, isn't that hate speech? Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's hate speech to talk about science, to have scientists on, experts to discuss why these numbers don't make any sense, or economists on to talk about why the economy's tanking and so many people are being forced into poverty, or to have a conversation about the Great Reset and what these billionaires are planning as things head forward into the COVID pass, and limiting our right to travel if we don't get the mandatory vaccine that's headed our way. So as you can tell, I'm starting to get pretty frustrated here. And I was actually happy to talk to George and Joseph and just have a little bit more of a laid back conversation. But what we're talking about is actually very serious. And so I really want to thank those guys, give a big shout out to those guys for standing up. And frankly, I hope that we see more activism here in the United States. I've talked to people now in Europe and Canada. There are movements that are happening there, but here in the United States, seems like there's a slow start. I've had a conversation with Clyde Cleveland. I'd like to have him back on the show. We're trying to talk solutions, but hopefully we'll see some political action here in the U.S. to stand up against all of this craziness, including just even the right to talk about it. I mean, amazing to live in a society, to think that the United States would get to this place where opening your mouth to express your opinion about something which I feel like should appear to be obvious to just about anyone, closing down the entire economy, forcing millions into poverty for a disease that, there are potential cures for, that science has the ability to deal with, where the hospitals were never going to be overrun, where we can clearly see there's not that. I mean, in our actual lives, if it wasn't for what we're watching on the TV, if the corporate government narrative wasn't being pumped through the TV and on the radio 24/7, would you think that there was a severe pandemic going on in your life? You probably heard of a few people who got sick. It'd be a bad flu bug year. So I really want you to think about that. Like, what's going on in the world where if you shut that TV off, how would you feel? How scared would you be about getting sick right now? Where is that fear coming from? Why do you feel so afraid? And why is it that when people notice this and they speak out, the cancel culture moves in and they have to be afraid of literally losing their jobs? There have been doctors who have lost their jobs because they've stood up to speak up about this. So great show. Let me give you out the contact information again. You can check out The Line Canada on Facebook, thelineinternational.com if you want to find them on the web, and at The Line Media on Twitter. The Ontario Civil Liberties Association will be at www.ocla.ca. They are at OnCivLib on Twitter. That's OnCivLib on Twitter, and you can also get them on Facebook, although Joseph was saying that they've been purged and they kind of come back. They're up right now, but it's Ontario Civil Liberties Association on Facebook. And of course, you can check me out, The Shift with Doug McKenty, on Facebook and YouTube. I am at D McKenty on Twitter. and you can find me on the web at www.theshiftnow.com. So thanks again, everybody, for listening to this show. Great conversation. We'll keep it going. I think I'm going to be doing a shorter series on the psychology of lockdown with George, so you'll see him again coming down the pike, and we got a lot of great content. Just did an interview with Dr. Judy Mikovits. That'll be coming out next week. So thanks again, everybody, for listening, and remember to like, subscribe, and please share. Because you are the way this information gets spread around. So share this with your friends, and I hope you really think about what you heard, and we'll see you again soon. All right, thanks. Take care.